Ibn Rushd, or known in the West as Averroes, had a far greater influence amongst the Jews and Christians than he did to the Muslims. This is because at the time Ibn Rushd was indeed the best commentator on Aristotle's works. So anyone wanting to engage in Aristotelian debates in the Middle Ages should have involved himself in reading Ibn Rushd's thoughts and his interpretation of Aristotle, which made him widely known amongst the West scholars. Ibn Rushd was born in Cordoba in the year 1126 in a family that paid great attention to sciences. His grandfather, Abul Walid ibn Rushd, was a presiding judge in Cordoba, as was his father. Growing up in such a great environment, Ibn Rushd had received traditional education since childhood, especially sciences related to language, fiqh, hadith, and the Quran, under the guidance of prominent scholars of his time. Cordoba itself, the largest city and the capital of Andalusia, became a center of knowledge. Many prominent scholars in various disciplines came from Cordoba. Historians generally agree that Cordoba was like a head to a body, a center for greatest scholars. In Cordoba, there were three famous people named Ibn Rushd, all three of whom came from the same family. The three were a judge, a scholar, and a philosopher. They were the grandfather Muhammad ibn Rushd, the author of al-Bayn wa al-Tahsil, a large book that became the reference for the Maliki school, the father Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Rushd, father of Ibn Rushd, and the son Ibn Rushd, the figure whom we are going to discuss. His initial education started from studying the Quran in his own home with his father. Besides, he studied Islamic sciences such as fiqh, exegesis, hadith, and Arabic literature. In the field of fiqh, under the guidance of his father, he studied the book Muwatta, the work of Imam Malik, commenting on and memorizing it at a young age. His mastery in the field of fiqh can be seen from his very monumental work, Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid, most of which was written since 1168, when he was 44 years old. He also understood deeply and broadly the science of Kalam or Islamic theology, especially Ash'ariyah, such as the works of al-Juwayni, al-Ghazali's teacher, as well as the works of al-Ghazali. He also studied medicine. After studying religion and medicine, he also studied mathematics, physics, astronomy, logic, and philosophy, so that he became an encyclopedic scientist who mastered various sciences. Ibn Rushd came from a family of scientists. His father and grandfather were the lovers of knowledge and were highly respected scholars in Spain. In addition, both of them also had close relations with the rulers, in the form of scientific relations, both education and law. For the first time, Ibn Rushd left his hometown in 1153. He went to Marrakesh at the request of Ibn Tufail, who was at the time the personal physician of Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf of the Muwahhidin dynasty. Ibn Tufail introduced Ibn Rushd to the Caliph. During the meeting, the Caliph, who really liked philosophy, wanted to access the works of Aristotle, but it was difficult to understand and digest them directly from Greek. The Caliph also complained about the poor translation at the time. Ibn Tufail asked Ibn Rushd to translate and interpret Aristotle's works, because Ibn Tufail himself felt that he had been old and too busy to do this work. His expertise in various fields of science, especially fiqh, caused the government to appoint Ibn Rushd a qadi or judge, which was his first position in the palace. He became a judge in Seville in 1170. After 2 years, he was then moved to Cordoba in 1172. A year later, in 1173, he was appointed Qadi al-Qudad, the presiding judge. He held this high position until the end of his life, and for more than 20 years he held this position until his exile by the palace to a Jewish village. Ibn Rushd was accused of teaching heretical doctrines. In his trial, his works were understood hastily and arbitrarily. They accused Ibn Rushd of having apostatized or murtad against all beliefs held by Muslims because he adhered to Greek philosophy in contrast to Islamic doctrine. Due to that, many of Ibn Rushd's works were burnt at the time. Then Ibn Rushd was exiled, but it didn't last long, only 1 year. When exiled in Lucena, Ibn Rushd was welcomed by his students, such as Maimonides and Joseph ben Jehoven, who were Jews. And Ibn Rushd was given proper facilities, thus Ibn Rushd's teaching and writing activities could continue. Aristotle mentions the response of the Jews to Ibn Rushd in the exile was very friendly and how eager they were to translate Ibn Rushd's works into their language, Hebrew, and disseminated them. Therefore, it is not surprising that at the time of the burning of Ibn Rushd's works, Arabic books were destroyed, but in different places. Ibn Rushd's works could still be found in Hebrew thanks to the efforts of his students amongst the Jews in his exile. But Ibn Rushd's period of exile didn't last long, only 1 year. In 1197, Ibn Rushd's sentence of exile was lifted by the Caliph after knowing that his case was being defended by many prominent people in Seville. Ibn Rushd then lived together with his family in Cordoba. He was given the special honor of coming before the Caliph in Marrakesh with the intention of returning his position in the court. Ibn Rushd is known as a very prolific writer. He wrote many works in various scientific disciplines, such as medicine, astronomy, fiqh, literature, kalam, and philosophy. His attention to science was extraordinary. Because of that, a scholar maintained that in Spain there had never been a major and perfect scientist like Ibn Rushd. He spent more than 10,000 pieces of paper to write his works. So it would not be an exaggeration to say that Ibn Rushd never left his reading activities since he was an adult, except on the night his father died and in his wedding night. His works showed broad mastery of various scientific disciplines despite the fact that his specialization was philosophy. According to Ernest Renan, Ibn Rushd's works reached 78 pieces, 2 titles on literature, 8 titles on fiqh, 20 titles on medicine, 4 titles on astronomy, 5 titles on theology, 28 titles on philosophy, and 11 titles in various topics. Unfortunately, many of Ibn Rushd's works cannot be found today, except for a few which are still saved in several major European libraries. Most of the existing books are no longer in their original language, Arabic, but have been translated into Latin and Hebrew. It was caused by the problems that befell him. During that time, many of his works, especially in the field of philosophy, were destroyed and burnt at the behest of the Caliph. Some of his most famous works are first, Fasl Maqal fima bayn al-Hikma al-Shariah min al-Ittisal. This book confirms that it is the Quran itself that advocates rational study. This reveals the rational method in discussing philosophical questions. Second, Tahafut al-Tahafut. In this book, Ibn Rushd rejects al-Ghazali's refutation of the philosophers through his work Tahafut al-Falasifah. According to Ibn Rushd, the demonstrative statements in books on the subject, especially those of Aristotle, are not like what Ibn Sina and others from the Islamic circle explained, because in their works there was something unnoticed. In short, the philosophy understood by al-Ghazali was not taken from the opinion of Aristotle directly, but the opinions brought by Ibn Sina. Tahafut al-Tahafut is more flexible than Fasl in explaining the superiority of religion based on revelation over reason associated with a religion that is purely rational. Third, Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid. This book is one of the important references in Malik fiqh, a logical description of monumental Islamic law. This work is a treatise on ikhtilaf, comparative science of fiqh schools, which evaluates and considers in every case and every angle opinions put forward not only by large schools or prominent individuals, but also by small schools. Fourth, Kulliyat fit Tib. This book is one of the most important books in Ibn Rushd's medicine. It shows the influence of Aristotle's philosophy on him and his adoption of Aristotle's medical theories, in addition to his critiques of his predecessors in several fields of medicine. There are still many works of Ibn Rushd in the form of short and long commentaries. Although many of Ibn Rushd's works were destroyed or burned, in subsequent developments they were available in Latin, only Arabic written books which were destroyed. Therefore, his works were spread in various places in Europe in Latin and Hebrew languages. The influence of Ibn Rushd in the West was not direct, but through the translation movements. They, influenced by Ibn Rushd, were known as Averroists. When the West was in dark ages, Islam had reached the pinnacle of glorious civilization. In the East, Islamic civilization was concentrated in cities such as Cairo and Baghdad. Meanwhile, in the West, the center of Islamic civilization were the regions of Sicily and Spain, with cities such as Toledo, Granada, Seville, and Cordoba. Islamic philosophy, especially Ibn Rushd's philosophy, developed in the West through the translation movement of his works. Many names appeared in the process of translating Arabic works into Latin. In fact, this translation movement was fully supported by King Frederick II by establishing a university in Naples in 1224. It was at this university that Thomas Aquinas studied and got acquainted with Aristotle's thoughts through Islamic thinkers, especially Ibn Rushd. The great attention of King Frederick II to the movement of translating the works of Muslim philosophers led to a suspicion that the king had embraced Islam, but for certain reason he hid it. Ibn Rushd's writings were translated in 1220 in Sicily, and Michael Scott's published Latin version of Ibn Rushd's major commentaries on the Anima, Metaphysics, Physics, and the Caelo Latin versions of the medium commentaries on the Generation et Corruption and Meteorologica. Then in the 1240s, Hermann Alemanus in Toledo wrote a Latin version of Ibn Rushd's intermediate commentaries on ethics and poetics. Meanwhile, al-Tahafut was only translated at the beginning of the 14th century by Calonimus, who was a Jew. It is clear that Ibn Rushd's works translated into Latin were in almost every case related to the study of Aristotle. This didn't happen by chance, but because of the reflection and interest of medieval Christian thinkers. At first, the influence of Ibn Rushd's philosophy entered Europe due to Aristotle's philosophy, because indeed Ibn Rushd was considered the best commentator on Aristotle. Ibn Rushd's understanding of the works of Aristotle was viewed as the most correct compared to the comments made by other writers earlier. In the Jewish world, many prominent thinkers such as Gershonite, Hasdai Crescas, and Abravanel inevitably used Ibn Rushd as introduction to Aristotle, although they were also able to distinguish between the views of Aristotle and his commentators. Because of Aristotle's concise and abstract style, they seemed to need an interpreter, and it was Ibn Rushd who was able to fulfill that need well through his large collection of commentaries in various forms on Aristotle's works. Averroism is an intellectual movement that developed in the West in the 13th century to the 17th century. The term Averroism started to be used in the West around 1270 or 72 years after Ibn Rushd's death. The presence of Ibn Rushd's philosophy did not receive a warm welcome from Islamic civilization. On the other hand, the rationality of Ibn Rushd's philosophy brought fresh air to the Western world. Ibn Rushd's philosophy ignited the fire of a revolution. Ibn Rushd, with his ability to comment on the works of Aristotle, awakened a culture of thinking that had never been experienced by the West. In the Jewish world, although many great philosophers wrote about Ibn Rushd, according to Oliver Leaman, it would be wrong to call all of them Averroists. Averroism has a certain view of the relationship between philosophy and religion, and this view has its roots in Ibn Rushd. However, the Jewish Averroists were not blind followers of Ibn Rushd, for they combined their interpretation of Ibn Rushd with the views of Maimonides and Abraham ibn Ezra, who were also interested in the relationship between philosophy and religion. The first Jewish Averroist was Isaac al-Balagh, who came from the Perennial region in the second half of the 13th century. He respected Ibn Rushd deeper than both other Islamic philosophers and Maimonides. Moses Naboni, who was born in Perpignan around 1300, was also an Averroist. Amongst his writings were many important commentaries on Ibn Rushd. The next figure of Averroism is Elijah Delmedico. The influence of Ibn Rushd's philosophy is very strong in his philosophy. He wrote in Latin and Hebrew. Even though his work was based primarily on Ibn Rushd's Fasl Maqal, in contrast to Ibn Rushd, according to him, religion and philosophy were very different scopes. In addition to the names mentioned previously, there were actually many more Averroists in the Jewish world, such as Moses ibn Crispin, Joseph ibn Kaspi, and Joseph ibn Waqo. Many thinkers in the Jewish intellectual world felt that they had to engage in Ibn Rushd's thoughts in one way or another. As I mentioned earlier, Jewish Averroists were not blind followers of Ibn Rushd. They were clearly rather different from both Ibn Rushd's philosophy and from Christian Averroism. A distinctive contribution of Jewish Averroism is its approach to the relationship between philosophical truth and religious truth. Like Ibn Rushd, who united philosophy and religion, that he considered twin brothers. In the Christian world, Ibn Rushd's philosophy also flourished. Latin philosophers depended on translated books to understand Islamic and Jewish thoughts. The increasing level of familiarity with Aristotle's texts through Ibn Rushd's commentaries marked the beginning of the transformation of Ibn Rushd's philosophy into the Christian world. Ibn Rushd's works were used at the University of Paris in the late 1220s. Irrespective of a pen of the study of Aristotle and commentaries on Aristotle's works in the Faculty of Literature. The Aristotelian curriculum was adopted by the Faculty of Literature in Paris and Oxford, and Ibn Rushd's commentaries, very detailed, proved to be primary references for the experts there. Ibn Rushd played this role, no doubt providing the detailed interpretations they needed to comprehend Aristotle's arguments. Apart from this general role, Ibn Rushd was also often seen to be the inspiration behind the thought movement, namely Latin Averroism. The most famous figure as a pioneer of Averroism was Zinger van Brabant, and was followed by students such as Bernard van Nijvel, Boethius de Deci, and Antonius van Palmer. These figures read and studied commentary works of Ibn Rushd on Aristotle's philosophy. The basis of rationality developed by Ibn Rushd turned out to be really attracting their attention, until at the end there was an awareness to optimize the use of reason and abandon ideas contrary to the rational aspect. Zinger van Brabant's thoughts presented Ibn Rushd as a correct view, or at least as a correct reading of Aristotle, while Boethius de Deci emphasized the autonomy of reason within the scope of reason itself, which had no direct relationship with Ibn Rushd's philosophy. The ideas of Zinger and Boethius had little effect on their successors, because they were included in a list of condemnations carried out by the Archbishop of Paris in 1270. In the declaration, Dampier didn't specify which teachings of Ibn Rushd were deemed forbidden. However, in March 1277, he issued another further announcements by providing a list of 219 teachings that were considered heretical, and the followers of Ibn Rushd should have been punished. These announcements also referred to several names, such as Zinger van Brabant and Boethius de Deci. Previously, the list was used to seize liberal thinkers who were deemed to have disturbed Parisian society. As a result of the condemnation, no one dared to declare himself a follower of Averroes. However, at the beginning of the 14th century, John Jandon publicly declared himself an Averroist, and the interpretation attributed to Ibn Rushd the correct reading of Aristotle. This was also followed by Urban of Bologna as well as Paul of Venice, and other followers of Ibn Rushd's philosophy began to dare to openly state their position. John Jandon's writings were widely read in Europe, and the Averroism of John Jandon was adopted in the following decades by scholars in Bologna and Padua. In Erfurt in the late 14th century, and Krakow in the mid-15th century. In the 16th century, in Italy, several views attributed to Ibn Rushd became an important element in discussions of the intellect and the soul. At the University of Padua, the prominent figures of Averroism were Paul of Venice, Caetanus of Thinis, Agostino Nefer, Marcantonio Zimara, and Alessandro Accilini. According to Oliver Leaman, Averroism dominated all universities in Italy. Averroism actually had a great impact on the Western worldview regarding the position of philosophy and religion. Their interpretation of Ibn Rushd was so high that they didn't realize that the thoughts of Ibn Rushd they adopted were only used to place freedom of thought in high position, while the reconciliation of philosophy with religion, that was the main characteristic of Ibn Rushd's philosophy, was ignored by them. Eventually, their studies in the field of philosophy resulted in many views that no longer deserved to be attributed to Ibn Rushd, such as the view that reason is the only source of truth, while religion only brings falsehood, and the view that there is no immortality of the soul personally. In the subsequent developments, Averroism was even an anti-religious movement and only glorified reason. Irrespective of several of those misunderstandings, both Jewish and Latin Averroism considered Ibn Rushd to have been meritorious to have solved philosophical problems, especially Aristotle's philosophy. As additional information, Ibn Rushd, when old enough, met a young Ibn Arabi, a great Sufi from Andalusia who had had spiritual experiences at that time. In Ibn Arabi's narrative, I went one fine day to the house of Abul Walid ibn Rushd, Averroes, in Cordoba. He had expressed the desire to meet me personally because he had heard of the revelations which God had accorded me in the course of my spiritual retreat and had not hidden his astonishment concerning what he had been told. That is why my father, who was one of his intimate friends, sent me one day to his house under the pretext of having to perform some kind of commission, but in reality in order for Averroes to be able to have a talk with me. At this time I was still a beardless young man. Upon my entering the house, the philosopher rose from his place and came to meet me, showering upon me signs that demonstrated his friendship and consideration, and finally embraced me. Then he told me, "Yes," and I in turn told him, "Yes." Upon this, his joy increased in noting the fact that I had understood him. Then, becoming myself conscious of what had provoked his joy, I added, "No." Immediately, Averroes shrank. The color of his features changed. He seemed to doubt that about which he was thinking. He asked me this question: "What kind of solution have you found through illumination and divine inspiration?" I answered him, "Yes and no." Between the yes and the no, souls take their flight from their matter and the next become detached from their bodies. Averroes became pale. I saw him trembling. He murmured the ritual phrase, "There is no force but in God," because he had understood that to which I had alluded. There was no news that they met again other than that meeting. In addition to Averroism, what do you think? Is Averroism rational works useless in the face of spiritual enlightenment as Ibn Arabi experienced? Please give your opinion on the comments. I'll see you there.